All right, thank you, Tracy. So this book is the final product of an oral history research project that I began in 2021. My original goal was to document the experiences all around Lake Huron regarding the collapse of Chinook salmon fishery. And I wasn't able to get that larger project funded, but that allowed me to focus on Rogers City in a way that I probably otherwise wouldn't have. And so in keeping with the oral history nature of the book, I'm going to invite many members of the Rogers City community, so to speak, on stage with me to help present what really is your story and their story, much more than my own. So in doing so, I'm going to be using clips from the original interview recordings that I did with them. And I want to point out that these are available on the Library of Michigan's database called Michiganology online. I've got a screenshot of what that webpage looks like here. These interviews capture best what you'll find in the book. And so I hope you'll enjoy recognizing the voices of friends and family as they tell their story. This first set of clips takes us back to the 1960s and 70s, around the time of the initial introduction of Pacific salmon in the Great Lakes.
I happened to grow up about a block from our small boat harbor. And I fished, so we were on the lake. Up until that point, there wasn't a whole lot of big sport fishing in the big lake. My dad always said when he was a kid, which was of course many years before that, the lake wasn't good for anything more than a darn cold swim. And that was just, nobody really fished it. There were lake trout and things out there. Of course, the salmon population came in later. And so I saw that evolve.
The local boys snagged them out of the rivers. And when I first came here, the fellow that I bought the store from lived on Linden, which is a street that the Trout River runs next to out to the lake. And I saw 3 boys on bikes, and they had 2 salmon on each handlebar, and the fish were dragging on the street, and they were riding home.
So you came in 83, 84, that was right around the time where the big initiative to stock
just started.
Yeah.
They did some Akiak River stocking in, I believe, around 67. And I think it was around 68, 69, we started being able to harvest some of the jacks and the early spawners in the Akiak River. And that kind of started it all. And it kind of went that way for quite a while. And then the population just kept growing and growing. And to go to the river and catch a 30-pound fish was just, I mean, it was just normal. And most of us got our limit and left and came back tomorrow, or when the weekend was over, you went back downstate and lived till the next time you could get back up.
But there were just plentiful salmon in the rivers. And then it was probably, 1972 or so that we, anyway, started really going out in the lake and finding out that, wow, what a great sport fish the salmon is in the lake. And it was quite a bit different than just trying to haul them out of the river. I mean, that was fun, but you get out in the lake and start fishing salmon. It was terrific. So that was a real peak time in the 70s for salmon fishing in the Rogers City area.
The 70s, you say then?
Yes, all through the 70s was really good in the Rogers City area.
Oh, okay. So that's before really the major stocking.
We went out regularly all through the 70s. It was a very good time for salmon fishing. And then it just kept getting better as those years went on. But yeah, we had great salmon fishing all through the 70s.
Like I heard from folks like Bruce Grant, Matt Hollaba, Ivan Wergo and Frank Christ, of course, many people in northern Michigan's first observations and experiences with salmon happened in the Akiak River. But the rivers and creeks of all of northern Michigan really provide excellent spawning habitat for salmon. And within a few generations, the salmon began spawning throughout tributaries to the northern portion of Lakes Huron and Michigan. Anglers around the Rogers City area began to really figure out that the salmon fishery lent itself well to this area. Because the water gets deep fairly close to shore, and the westerly winds keep the waves to a minimum and blow the warm surface water offshore, it makes the habitat that salmon, as well as the alewives and smelt that they like to eat, really accessible to fishermen with even just small boats and from shore and even the breakwall of the harbor. Anglers in Rogers City in the early 80s began advocating for increased salmon stocking in the Rogers City area because, as they argued, it would be good bang for the Michigan DNR's buck. Fish stocked here would survive and be able to generate a lot of fishing, especially compared to other places that the state could stock. The concern, though, was that stocking fish in more obvious places like the Akiak River would generate too much trespassing, littering, and snagging, which had become problems. And snagging had been made illegal. But it just so happened that Swan River, which runs through calcite property and is off limits to the public, was the perfect place to stock salmon to contribute to the fishery in Lake Huron and avoid the negative aspects associated with salmon fishing in the rivers upon those fish's return. And furthermore, a temporary weir could be set up in Swan River that could be used to corral the returning fish. The Michigan DNR could collect and fertilize eggs, and then the surplus fish would be used for commercial purposes. The state of Michigan so liked the circumstances in the Rogers City area that they kind of proposed back to Rogers City to stock 900,000 to 1 million salmon every year beginning in 1983 to create a salmon fishery that they proposed or, hopefully maybe exaggerated a bit, who knew, but that would range from the Straits of Mackinac all the way to the mouth of Saginaw Bay. Just to put this in perspective, at the height of the state of Michigan's stocking of Chinook salmon, throughout the entire state, about 4 million would be stocked. So Rogers City was getting a quarter or more of the state's entire Chinook salmon production. This is a picture from one of those first stockings in 1983. In the pictures, Frank and Teresa Christ, as well as Harry Whiteley, biologist Steve Swan. This is what the weir looked like, at least in those early years, and water was diverted from upstream into this chute, and that created something that the salmon would jump into, which was this corral where they would be held until they were either processed for the fillets in their meat or allowed to sexually mature. And so, on the heels of the major salmon stocking focus in Rogers City, some community members here pushed to begin a salmon fishing tournament to line up with the time when those big 3-year-old Chinook salmon from that first big stocking event would begin to show up in the area in big numbers at the end of August. So this next set of sound clips describes the buildup to the first couple tournaments.
86 is when it started. Mm-hmm. And we had a resident here, his name was Mike Petrinsky.
Yeah.
And Mike was in the Air Force, and he was stationed in Oscoda, but he was from Rogers City. And he wrote a couple books on steelhead fishing in the rivers. And when this hit in his hometown, he was excited, but he was an intelligence officer down in Oscoda. He went up here for the weekends. But he was part of the Michigan Outdoor Writers Association. And I give Mike all the credit for the tournament here because he had the experience how to build one. But they weren't prepared for it. I'm telling you, they were lying almost out to 23. What do we do with all these boats?
Yeah, in the old days, they used to do a Le Mans start, a running start, and they'd fire off this
Well, Mike said he was the one who fired the.
Yeah, he used to be down there officiating, and that was quite nothing but assholes and elbows and people running all over the place.
Well, nobody drowned,
Yeah.
Well, we'd go down, I several times, I'm not sure, 2 or 3 times, I did the shotgun start, get out on the break wall, and I think it was 6:30, I'm not sure now the time, but when the time came, fired that shotgun, and it was unreal to hear those engines roar up. And you could hear it all over Rogers City, those engines, and there were so many boats, and they were fighting to get out of the harbor, which was dangerous at the time because there was too many boats for the harbor. So eventually, they moved the starting point into the lake, so they didn't have to compete with that entrance to get an exit to get out of that harbor. It was actually, the small boats were in danger, there's no question about it, but fortunately, we never had any incidents. But it was hazardous, to say the least, for all those boats to get moving at one time.
Mm-hmm.
But when they fired up all those engines, it was a roar.
Well, we can win that tournament. We only need to catch one good fish, there's nothing to it. So we got in this 14-foot boat and went out here and went fishing. Well, there was a few more boats around in the 80s. The first time we went out in the evening, we pulled out of the harbor and everybody made a left turn out of the harbor. They trolled down to Seagull Point, went out to about 100 feet, and went back around, trolled over to Adams Point, and then came back up along the shoreline to the harbor. And that was the pad. It was like a big parade out there that night. And when it got dark, here was this whole line of lights on the boats. Well, that was my first experience out there. We didn't catch a fish, but we learned real quickly you didn't want to go the opposite direction of everybody. Everybody was mad at you.
That first tournament, were you the only boat that was in Swan Bay doing what you were doing?
Oh God, there was so many boats in there
Okay.
that it's unbelievable. You would not believe. There had to be, I couldn't even, that's a long time ago, okay? That's a long time ago. There was so many boats, I've never seen so many boats, okay? There's so many boats, there was 35, 40 boats anyway. And they had spotter boats out. Because I talked to one guy that was in a spotter boat. They're just checking to make sure nobody's doing anything wrong. And they're going, wow, you guys are catching fish like crazy. And the funny thing was, it was onshore wind, it was windier than a bugger, and everything was riled up.
So we made a pass in there, we nailed 2 fish right off the gate, One time, that guy that was in there came up on a weight, and when he came down, he bottomed out right on the...
Really?
Oh yeah, it was bad. Those waves were huge. There were waves as big as this ceiling in here. Big waves crashing in there. So it was really crazy. But we made, I don't remember how many passes. I don't remember if we had 5 or 6 fish. I don't remember what it was off the top of my head. And then we made the long trek to go, because we had to weigh them back. We had to weigh those fish in, so we had to go back to the harbor. We couldn't stay in and carry our fish over there. So it was kind of an interesting ride back going over those waves. And when we got back there, and all of a sudden we take the leader. Now we're ahead of the game. We got the first place fish, we're in first place in the boat tournament. Well, everyone got off the lakes.
We came in on that salmon tournament, and we quit at 19 because I knew we had 19, but I didn't want to make a mistake. So we're going to quit one short. And we came in, and it was getting close to quitting time anyway, because I think that was a Sunday 1 o'clock cutoff, and we had to get back. But we came in. People asked, What did you catch them on? I show them this little chrome grizzly. I said, 18 of our 19 fish came on this. Bullshit. Bullshit. You know what? I said, this was a brand new lure. I took it out of the package this morning. Brand new lure. Look at it. It is just carved up with teeth marks. Look at it. This was a brand new lure this morning. Bullshit. What can I tell you? What can I tell you?
So for me, it was exciting reading back through the back issues of the Presque County Advance during 1986 and the build-up to the first Rogers City Salmon Tournament. And if you think about it, it was a really big unknown how well that major stocking would pan out. There were people that were scared it would cause bedlam, but also the methods for trolling for salmon in the Great Lakes were still developing. And although the weather was really dicey for those first two tournaments, the salmon returns and the fishing have to be described as better than anyone could have expected. I had so much fun listening to Ken and his wife Mandy describe their fishing stories from the heyday, sitting on top of a picnic table in their backyard, which is right on Lake Huron, with the sound of the waves kind of quietly crashing on shore. You know, it's funny for a guy that told me on the phone, he was reluctant to, I don't typically say a whole lot. We had no problem spending 3 hours talking about fishing. A cooler of Stroh's beer between us, which I didn't even know still existed. One of my favorite lines from all of the reading I did for this came after the 1997 Rogers City Salmon Tournament. Let's see, imagine 1,548 salmon weighing in excess of 20,000 pounds. That is how much fish was pulled out of the Presque County waters over the weekend by participants in the 12th annual Rogers City Salmon Tournament. I remember reading this line and thinking, how long did it take to fillet all those fish? And what do they do with all the carcasses? But really, by any standards, West Coast standards, any of the Great Lakes, salmon fishing, all through the history of it, the fishing was really phenomenal here, not just at the tournaments. And it stayed good through the early 2000s, and there were some monster fish caught. So this is a fish that came in just under 33 pounds. This is a 38-pound that was caught out of Swan Bay. This is a 31-pounder that a teenager caught. And this is a 30-pounder that was caught, I think, a day or the weekend after the salmon tournament that weighed in at 30 pounds. But then this brings me to the subtitle of the book, The Rise and Fall of a Great Lakes Fishery. And so while it was my curiosity about the negative effects on people of the alewife and salmon collapse in Lake Huron, from my conversations with people in Rogers City, the emphasis was much more on the positive aspects of the fishery over the years. Many people were reluctant to even use the term crash and often pushed back against claims that salmon were no longer in Lake Huron. And so wanting the book to stay true to the sentiments of the people that I spoke with, I had different subtitles in mind, such as Memories of a Great Lakes Fishery or Celebrating a Great Lakes Fishery. And I worried that the use of the term the fall would be received as a mischaracterization. And so while I'm very proud of everything between the covers of the book, I do have some misgivings about the publisher's kind of immovability on the choice of the subtitle, which I admit does contain more narrative tension. But then again, I do believe there's a lot of evidence for a Chinook salmon population crash in Lake Huron in the mid-2000s. Biologists trying to understand the ecological phenomenon were quick to realize that alewives essentially disappeared from the lake. Alewives are a smallish herring species native to the Atlantic Ocean, and they, in most years, were the main prey of Chinook salmon. The initial explanation for this phenomenon was that the Chinook salmon had become so abundant in Lake Huron that the volume of alewives that they ate consumed the alewives' ability to replace themselves. Later understanding of the ecology of Lake Huron places more emphasis on the invasion of zebra and eventually quagga mussels, on greatly reducing the ability of energy that starts from phytoplankton and photosynthesis from being transferred to zooplankton and on up the food web to alewives, and eventually to salmon. Instead, the invasive mussels filter plankton and supported the growth of the mussels themselves, and in doing so redirect energy to the lake bottom where the mussels live. And then it doesn't make the same routes that it used to the higher levels in the food web that used to support salmon. No one tells this story better than retired Michigan DNR biologist Jim Johnson. And so I encourage anybody really interested to go back and listen to my original interview with him. This next set of clips captures some of what the people here saw during the beginning of the crash.
Yeah, never had any type of thought of it going away. I just, I planned, I could have moved out of the state. I could have took jobs other places. Family and salmon fishing kept me here. Mm-hmm. It really did. And there's a lot of other contributors, but I never foresee the so-called crash of the salmon. There was no thought in my mind whatsoever. I actually wanted to charter fish, and pretty confident I could make a good living off that. But other jobs kind of sidetracked me a little bit. But then, the salmon fishing started declining a little bit when I was really interested in doing that. And then there was a scare and a worry that, wow, what's going on here?
You knew something was happening, okay? Because for a while you had a fish that was 30 inches long, 35 inches long. It was close to 40 pounds. In 3 or 4 years, that fish that was the same length was 17 pounds.
When people began to panic in 2004, I mean, here we're getting the big heads, skinny bodies, they're looking horrible. And if you think about it, up until 2002, actually going into 2003, people were happy. See, the people really didn't have anything to point to. You do now. You can point to Lake Huron. Look what happens if you have too many predators.
Now it's a whole different fishery. I mean, things have changed drastically on a number of fronts. Certainly invasive species has had a big impact. The collapse of the alewife has really hampered the ability for the salmon to thrive. Lake trout have adapted to eating gobies. There's some smell now, I think, but it's just completely different. In my lifetime, to see an ecological shift like that is just phenomenal.
Now, there's data from the annual Rogers City Salmon Tournament that also speaks strongly to the collapse, both in terms of participation in the tournament as well as the size of the winning fish. So on this graph, the blue dots correspond with the left axis and depict the number of boats in the tournament each year. The red line is the size of the winning fish in pounds and corresponds to the right axis. As you see, the tournament built up, reaching between 300 and 360 boats for much of the 90s, and the winning fish often exceeding 30 pounds as late as 2002. But then, as you can also see, by the mid-2000s, the stats that had been pretty stable for more than a decade declined rapidly. Another quirky stat that mirrors the fishery decline is the weight of fish waste that had to be hauled from the fish cleaning station. So in 1996, the marina got a multi-million-dollar upgrade, and with it also got a brand new fish cleaning station with an industrial-strength garbage disposal called a fish grinder that allowed anglers to dispose of the guts and carcasses by washing them essentially away into the city sewer system. However, that fish waste created such an organic load on the wastewater system that as early as mid-July, the fish cleaning station would have to be closed down, right as the salmon fishing was beginning to pick up. And as retired worker there, Rob Portman, told me, anglers would have to fill big barrels that outside the fish cleaning station that the Department of Public Works would come down once or twice a day and cart them off to be buried in pits dug on the calcite property. Kind of a perversion of the salmon life history. By 2008, though, the volume of the fish carcasses from salmon and other species being caught and filleted in Rogers City had declined so much that the city no longer had to cart off the waste and the fish cleaning station could remain open all summer and fall. And so for this presentation, like the book, it was challenging to distill decades worth of experiences and memories into a nice clean summarization. But it's not that I would really want to do that anyway. I think the value of this lies in the diversity of the stories told and the listener and reader kind of coming to their own diverse conclusions. This final collection of clips presents some reflections on the history of the salmon fishery and its legacy in Rogers City.
Some would say that the loss of the salmon, the DNR could have done more to prevent that by cutting back stocking more quickly, but I don't think that's politically feasible. And in hindsight now, with the bottom uppers argument becoming more and more persuasive, I don't think the DNR could have done anything to stop the alewife collapse in Lake Huron. It was going to happen.
And it just created an energy. It just created an energy that right now we're quite honestly in the process of determining how to get back. So the fishery brought the energy, and that's always how it was. And just again, both locally and with visitors, just a lot of vibrancy that we don't quite have since the fishery has become more diminished.
I drive through those towns all the time and just always go down to the marina, you know, like every port that I go through, Oscoda, Alpena, Rogers City, the smaller towns too, take a walk out on the beach, and how quiet it is there was kind of a weird feeling compared to previously. Like I'd worked out here in the 90s, early 90s, when the salmon fishery was just going crazy, and how busy the towns were due to the fishing activity. And there'd be people lined along the banks and stuff, you know, and that's pretty rare to see anymore.
Here, I mean, people just dealt with it. What else can you do?
So then when things started to go away, you know, when the mussels and everything, you know, the fishery just started to decline, they didn't really, you know, well, they didn't really seem to care if it went away or not. You know, there was people that were almost glad that you didn't have all these boat trailers up and down the streets and everything. And
we can gobs of stuff, and we like to do that too. You know, you don't have to fish every day.
Yeah.
And so you go and you get your canner done. And you come down to the beach, and it's ooh, let's take a little dunk and have a little fire and grill something up. And it's not all salmon anymore, you know? Mm-hmm. I mean, it's just our bag. I mean, we played the game. I loved it. But I'm not going to say bored with it. I mean, how can you get bored?
Because that salmon fishing went away, it's not like it created this void in Rogers City, or...
I don't think so, because the people that are still here, there's a few of them that fish for salmon. Like I said, maybe 40 boats on a good season. That's not a lot of people, you know. That's I don't think that the salmon fishing is, if it were recoverable, it'd be great for people that like to fish. Mm-hmm. It might be again great for the economy on a limited basis, but that's not going to do much for the employees at Calcite who don't work anymore, and the other employment situation.
And actually, I know quite a few people that I've met and been in contact with that's the reason they moved up here. You know, they retired, moved up here because of fishery, they fall in love with the area. You know, they stayed even though the fishes went south.
The salmon fishery brought in outsiders, like my family, and some stayed. And that was to the good. I also think it put the city in this whole region on the state's radar for grant assistance. And it helped the state take our area seriously, which it had not been It was a very internal kind of, it didn't need any help when you had the sugar daddy U.S. Steel taking care of everything. But when you're left high and dry, now you got to learn how to write a grant and build a relationship with the state agencies, which the fisheries really did help do. It highlighted the community as a lake-based economy, but not necessarily just about fish. About resorts, about bike trails and parks, about the underwater sanctuary. So it expanded the identity of the community rather than changing it, which I think was good. And it helped change the character of the place from just being a quarry town to something bigger. Again, it never took over the identity, and I think it was crazy, people that thought it would or could or should. It led to, I think, other types of recreation being considered as positives, and not either or but both. So it kind of built up more complex community character. And it really forced a recognition of a disrupted and complex lake ecosystem that hasn't been resolved and may never be resolved, but at least.
All right, and so with that, I'd like to thank all the people that shared their stories with me, and I'll close with a reading from the final chapter of the book. I want to discuss the title, The Salmon Capital of Michigan, because I find it to be a peculiar concept. To some, Rogers City was once the salmon capital of Michigan, but unlike political capitals, which might be supplanted or relocated, the title describing Michigan's premier salmon fishery has been neither assumed by nor bestowed upon another Michigan coastal community. There's been no heir to the throne. From what I can tell, the experience in Rogers City was a somewhat unique phenomenon that represented an exaggerated version of a similar salmon fishing scenario experienced throughout many Great Lakes port towns. But being the salmon capital was not an achievement or status that the people in Rogers City with whom I spoke paraded around or even seemed to care much about. While the term originated in the mid-1980s as a publicity tool to draw tourism to Rogers City, it wasn't an identity that was held onto by the people there. And so I think my use of the term as a title for this book should not be interpreted as how the people who shared their stories with me actually feel about the history of salmon fishing in Rogers City. However, to be a capital of anything depends upon the so-called capital's relation to other places, and many of the Rogers City residents who fish Lake Huron never really fished the Great Lakes anywhere else. My point is that the perception of Rogers City as a salmon fishing capital is best left to an outsider. I feel that Rogers City truly must have been the salmon capital of Michigan, and I hope that the stories told within this oral history preserve the best of which that title represented. Thank you.